around the room and having you introduce yourself really briefly and what you work on so that I have a point of reference about what you do and how you may interact with the media. Okay.
I'm Elaine Schumer. I'm the Division of Preventive Medicine, and so my research is focused on communications, but I also co-leader of dissemination cores that we try to get.
Wonderful. Yeah. I used to work a lot with the dissemination core at Lineberger. Yeah.
I'm Nathan Meyer. I'm the Director of Research Development in the Office of the Vice President for Research. So I just work with faculty in the pursuit and conduct of extramural funding.
Good on you for being here. Awesome.
I'm Adam Copeland with the UAB Public Relations Office. I'm here to help and serve you whenever you have research or clinical trials or programs that are going on campus. I'm here to help disseminate that information to external sources. So.
He's your best friend.
I'm Lisa Jackson. I'm a cardiologist. I'm fairly new to UAB. I spent many years in Boston and 11 years in Michigan. And I agree. I spoke with them several times and also worked with media people for American College of Cardiology. So.
Yeah, that's great. And American College of Cardiology in particular does a great job of providing professional development for its members in media training, and particularly around controversial issues and hostile interviewing. And that's something we'll touch on today, but we're not going to go deep into it. So if you have a professional association, you should definitely take advantage of that. Cool.
I'm Madeline Gibson. I'm with the CCTS. In the Research Commons arena. I would say I have mostly interacted with the media indirectly through my former boss, who was very adamant about specific word choice and learning from others' mistakes with the media. He was a big proponent of we should all be doing a better job. And then I would say in my CCTS role, I interact with a lot of industry sponsors. I recently went to a meeting where there were a lot of sponsors, and even though they're not media per se, interacting with people who are outside of our friendly university environment, I feel like.
That's good to know, and I can touch on some of the considerations in working with industry-sponsored research because I've been in the thick of that.
I'm Samir Rana. I'm a T32 postdoc scholar in cardiovascular division. I'm basically interested in my medical communication. That's why I'm here.
Great.
Hi, I'm Kristen Boggs. I work with graduate students who are in many of the UAB professional and health-related programs, but I actually work for a nonprofit called the Albert Schweitzer Fellowship. So one of my roles is to try and spread the word about what those students, whom we call fellows, are doing in their projects and try to get good media attention for both the fellows and then their schools.
Wonderful.
Hi, my name is Hai Chengxin. I'm doing research in the health services research, focusing on health economics, health policy, health outcome research. I'm currently working for some project. Our clients are pharmaceutical companies. I'm a little kind of cautious. What's the best, what's an effective way to communicate with them? Is there anything we need to pay attention to?
Great.
Jeff Hansen, I'm research editor for University Relations. I work with Adam. My background is in both newspaper journalism and I have a PhD in microbiology. So I end up writing about basic science a lot. And I've sort of been on both sides of the fence. And I'd like to invite all the people in the back to come sit at the table.
Yes, I was getting ready to say that. I said it earlier. This is not church. You do not have to sit in the back. I do not buy. See, only in the South can I make that joke. If I make that joke in New York, they're like, what? They just think I'm weird. So that's totally fine. That's totally fine. So let's just talk about why we're here today. And if I can make this work. Apparently not. Huh. Okay, it's on. It's just not advancing. That's okay. We'll just do it this way. Maybe. It seems to be frozen. There it is. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you all about the media environment. And for my public affairs colleagues, you will know this, but it's getting in. But I can talk to some specifics of what I've observed in the last couple of years, particularly in the health policy environment and how that reporting is changing. It's actually been getting better. While science communication for a while, around the recession, it got really bad, and it's getting slightly better now. But we can talk about sort of trends in media. Okay, now it's going to do itself, so we'll just go back. So I don't even know what you're doing. Let's start all again. Let's just, okay. And then we're going to talk about what to do with when a reporter calls, which is not run around and panic. Okay, there's actually stuff that you can do to make yourself more effective. And I don't like you. Okay, we'll just try this again. That's it. When all else fails, just reboot it or restart it or do whatever. So how you can prepare, how you can do your messaging around your research so that you can be media friendly. We will then talk about preparing tips, reporters behaving badly, which I'm sure everybody here has some word stories, tough questions, and after the interview. So today, this is the media, pretty much. The sky is falling. So some of the things we've been talking about in the couple of days I've been here is the hype versus hope. We tend to have these breathless clickbait headlines that talk about how amazing something is or how something's going to kill you. We have a 24-hour news cycle, which is good for us because it means that more is interesting than it actually should be. But also, it also means that sometimes people are really reaching, and so you get things like a reporter who has been out of journalism school for about 15 minutes calling you and saying, we're all gonna die from MRSA, and then that's where I go find the most boring infectious diseases faculty member that I can possibly put in front of them to get the other side of the story out. Online reporting, links, social media integration, we'll talk about a little bit. Edutainment, which makes me nuts. And then we'll talk a little bit about paid media because there are some, especially in the health field, there are some sort of predatory paid media organizations that act like they're news organizations, and you probably have a policy on them, but I just think faculty and staff should be aware that they exist and know what the pros and cons of working with them are. So things to keep in mind when you're thinking about your messaging. And so the thing when a reporter calls is most faculty members that I have worked with who are a little wary of the media are people who are saying, oh my God, a reporter called, I have to talk to them. I have to be on the radio, on TV, quoted in the newspaper, and I'm like risk averse and I don't like it. And we see all these headlines, right? You see headlines that are just blanket, that are incorrect, that are problematic. But here's what you want to think about. If you've got a paper in front of you that you're promoting, or if you're talking about a topic where you're really close to the topic, like, various disease incidences, whether or not people should take statins versus PCSK9 inhibitors, and all of these things, you've got to be clear about what you want to talk about. So you put it down in front of you and you think about, I try to limit it to no more than 3 messages, okay? And it doesn't matter really what they ask you, because most reporters in this arena aren't going to be very prepared or well educated. There are a few exceptions. So if you're talking to Rob Stein in NPR about basic science, or if you're talking to Gina Colada at the New York Times about cancer, there are going to be people who really know their stuff. You'll know who they are, and you'll know that you don't have to start at the basic level. But in general, you have to start at a fairly basic level for most media, particularly TV, right? Particularly lifestyle magazines, particularly local newspapers. So you think about, what is your headline and what are the 3 most important things I want the person to walk away with from this interview? okay? And as I've said before and in previous presentations, we tend to talk a lot about process in higher ed and academia and academic medicine. You don't want to talk about process. You want to talk about what is the pay, what is the money shot, what is the outcome that you want, and what are the implications. And so this research public relations assessment tool that I have passed around has some questions that you can ask yourself, and Becky will have it for those who watch it later. Some questions you can ask yourself that will kind of keep you focused on where's that payoff and where that message is. And that's where you want to be clear and you want to be concise. One of the things that drives reporters crazy that we're really good at in academia is talking about, here's my topic and I'm going along and I'm going to talk about it. No, here's this really interesting aside. And then we'll go back to the main topic and the reporters are like, I can't edit that, or I lost you somewhere in the middle. Or, you know, I have a friend who's like a brilliant breast cancer surgeon, physician scientist, and she cannot help it. She talks that way. And I've worked with her. And so, you know, at a certain point, she decided it's better for me to do things where I can answer questions in writing, because I just cannot edit my mind that way while I'm talking in front of a camera. And she decided that was okay with her. But in general, we try to be concise, conversational. It's a give and take. You don't have to hold forth. You don't have to fill the silences. It's like having a conversation. You want to be catchy, but not too catchy and colorful. So one of the things that we do badly in science that I really love it when I see somebody do it well, and I think people who deal with chronic disease are generally pretty good at this because they talk to patients a lot, is to provide an analogy, right? So an analogy, in basic science, sometimes you can get really stretched to get your analogy. I did one with a geneticist where it ended up being about gears and it just kind of all went off the rails. But I worked with a neuroscientist who looks at latent stimulation of cortical mini columns in the brain and its relationship to the communication disorders. And we came up with a shower curtain analogy, which is like when you leave the shower curtain out of the bathtub and your water goes all over the floor, that's like your signal dispersing when you have a certain brain morphology. And that worked out great. But try to be colorful and catchy, but not too colorful. So some instances in which I've had things be too colorful or flippant, a great example is the director of the Collaborative Cross Mouse Genetics Repository at University of North Carolina is somebody who I love dearly. Like, I've gone to his birthday party dearly. And Fernando was talking to the News and Observer about the Collaborative Cross, and he said, oh, I think the administration might have been worried that we would have mice all over the university, like they were running loose in the university. And I was like, no, don't say that, because they'll print it. And of course they did. Because if you joke about something like that, they think it's cute. And then, you know, you're like, okay, why are people coming to our IACUC with concerns? You know, well, you shouldn't have said that. And just when you're colorful or you use a lot of cliches, people will print that, and that's probably not how you want to come across, because we're serious academics about serious topics in a lot of cases. That doesn't mean we need to be uptight or obtuse, but it also means, but we need to have a sense of gravitas because we are experts and they're not, right? So presentation, there's 3 things to think about when you're having oh my God, I'm panicking because I'm in front of a TV camera moment. It's the visual, it's the vocal, and it's the verbal. So first thing, normally you're freaked out about what am I going to say. You should be the least freaked out about what am I going to say if you have done your homework on your message, right? Because you know what you're going to say, and you know the 3 points that you want to make. Vocal, how you sound, is something to think about. I personally hate my voice taped, and most people do, and it's, you know, it is known that this is a factor. But you can do things to make yourself sound professional and serious. So one of the things that I warn particularly younger investigators about is sometimes we do uptalk, where we end every sentence with the inflection as if we're asking a question. And it makes you sound like you're not sure about what you're talking about. So I really encourage people to maybe talk with a friend or go over your messaging with a friend and have them pay attention to that as well as to your message. And then visual, how you look, is less important than you think it is. That's what a lot of people freak out about. But in most TV settings, you're only going to be seen from the waist up. And there are some things that we'll go over about what to wear and what not to wear and what looks good on TV and what doesn't. But it's pretty simple, and it's the least of your problems, and you shouldn't worry about it.
Sorry, can you say not only how you look, but where you look?
Well, yes. And
I
okay, so it depends upon the setting you're in, and that's a really great question. I remember when I took Ned Sharpless, who's now the NCI director and is a pro at it, to do the first blind satellite interview that he ever did. And do you all know what a blind satellite interview is? So when you see somebody interviewing your congressperson from DC and they're in front of a backdrop of Birmingham or whatever, and that's where they are. They're in a room with a backdrop and a great big honking TV camera and a bunch of equipment and an earpiece. And they're looking straight into a camera, there's nobody to talk to, and you're trying to make your points and look like you're talking to the person who's on the other end of the feed, who is talking to you in your ear at the same time that you're trying to think. Okay, this is hard. And the first time I took Ned to do that, I was standing behind the camera because he likes to look up at the ceiling when he thinks, and I'm standing behind the camera going, because, and he would think this is hilarious. So I'm not telling tales out of school. He's a wonderful person, and he had a terrible sunburn that day because he'd been on the soccer field with his daughter all day, and he had a line across his forehead. But you know, I hope to think that maybe having a decent experience with his first blind satellite interview, where you have to look in the camera, made him more comfortable as NCI director. When you're in an interview session, when you have a camera in front of you, or you're doing Skype, those are also different. If you have a camera in front of you, most of the time they will set your eye line, which is where you're looking, to the reporter. And the reporter will stand to one side or the other of the camera very close. And if that's not the case, you should just look at the reporter. And that's going to make you look best. But most of the time, if they know what they're doing, if it's not student journalists, they're going to set up the eye line so it looks like almost you're looking in the camera, but not quite. If you're asked to do a Skype or Zoom or other video interview in your office, nobody looks good when you set the laptop on your desk, you sit in your chair, normal desk height, and the camera is looking up at you and looking up your nose. And we've seen a lot of that on TV now because it's become pretty common. So what I always advise folks to do is, so your PR people, like if you have a satellite on campus with a backdrop and stuff, go talk to them because they'll do it, and it's better than doing Skype. It's better quality, you'll look better, it won't be so horrible. If you're going to do it or have to do it via Skype, and NPR tends to want to default to Skype these days, take your camera or your laptop and prop it up on a stack of books or something so that it's more even with this part of your face. I've done a lot of interviews where I took a plastic standard file size box and put it up on the desk and had the person sit or stand where it's right about here. And then the camera on your laptop isn't looking up your nose, and it is a much more flattering angle. And then you can actually see what the lighting is going to look like by going in to a preview function on Skype, or if you're on a Mac, to go into the photo booth function, and you can see kind of what you're going to look like, and then that'll make you feel more comfortable. But then minimize yourself, because otherwise you're distracted by your own image on the screen. Okay.
I have one more related question.
That's a great question, though.
If you're being interviewed and the camera's facing you, but the reporter's right next to you, so you're having this conversation, you know, I never know how much time to spend facing the reporter versus facing.
So what I tell people in those situations is did you ever act as a kid? Were you ever on stage or in a chorus concert or something like that? Okay, so what they tell stage actors is to imagine the third wall, right? And unless you're Kevin Spacey in House of Cards, you're not supposed to breach that third wall, right? So what I would do, but on the other hand, you don't want to turn your back to the audience. So what you do in those cases is mostly don't turn away from the third wall or the camera, but so you have to remember it's there, but otherwise pay attention to who you're interacting with.
Oh, okay, I treated the camera as, in those situations, as another person, so I had a conversation between the two of us, the camera and the.
Yeah, you shouldn't treat the camera as another person. Pretend the camera is that third wall. You don't want to breach that third wall. You want to have a conversation with the person. Okay, the camera is just an observer. It's an audience member. They're down there in the orchestra pit. Okay?
Right.
And then that helps you not be so self-conscious, because the where do I look thing is really distracting, and it's pressure, can be pressure filled. So totally get it. Great questions from somebody who obviously has some experience.
I need a lot of.
So what do I do when a reporter calls me? And the answer is not to put your hands in the air and run around and panic and scream. What you do is, if you have them, if they get you live for some reason, you ask them a few questions. And then if they don't get you live and they leave a message, you can call your communications officer who can help you with things. So one of the things my ethos has always been as a communications officer, and that's what I think most of us try to do, is that faculty are free to talk to the media and free from talking to the media. And there's some media, especially locally, local cable news is notorious for this. They will cold call anybody who has something in their title that might be related to the topic at hand, right? And you might not be the best expert, and you might not be the right expert, and you also may not want to answer like questions that are based on completely non-science, because sometimes that happens. And so your communications officer is your wall, right? They are here, they are your defensive linemen that we block and tackle for our faculty, okay? And sometimes we'll reach out and grab somebody if we need them. But what we do is we can vet the reporter inquiry for you. And because we know the reporters that we deal with, we can say, hey, this is a reporter who's going to ask tough questions, but they're always going to be fair. Or this is a reporter who really doesn't know what they're talking about, so be really careful in your messaging. And they will help you with that. And they can call and see what the issue is and get a little bit more information. But if they leave a message, or if they get you, you want to know what their name is, who they work for, what their deadline is, because often there's this rush thing. Everybody's deadlines can be pushed a little bit. So you want to be responsive, but you don't want to be knee-jerk. And that is a very fine line, because responsiveness gets you placed, which is great, but you don't want to be knee-jerk, right? So take the moment, take a breath, call your colleague, ask what to do. That's why their cell phones are on their websites, all that good stuff. What is the topic that they want to have you talk about, and what are their questions in general? And you can say, I don't want to, I just want a general idea of what you would like, how you would like the conversation to go. You don't have to be super aggressive about it, but mostly they like to talk about themselves, and it's fine. And then who else is being interviewed? So this has come up with me in a couple of situations where sometimes reporters will try to put people head to head, and particularly people at the same institution. And I shared an example earlier today. So when the USPSTF came out with their new recommendations on mammography, they wanted us to do basically a cage match between the couple of faculty members we had on the USPSTF. And every time that I see some of those faculty, they thank me for not letting them do that. And one of the breast cancer surgeons, right? Because they're completely on different sides of the issue. And, and the nuance of explaining what is true at a population level may not be true at an individual risk level is often too much for the media, right? They just want to see people argue. And so that's where your communications officer can ask these questions, or you can ask who else are you interviewing, that can keep you from getting into one of those situations. Mike Pignoni and I are best friends because of that. I never let him do that. If you want to be a media-friendly expert, again, I said speed is important, but you don't want to be knee-jerk. And can you speak to this issue? So this is the thing. If this is in your wheelhouse, your media relations people are going to know, or you all can have a conversation about that. If it's not in your wheelhouse, you don't necessarily want to be that expert. Here's the thing that I'm going to tell you, though. We are super specialized in academic medicine, right? Super, super, super specialized. And so you may think, well, there's these 3 other people in my department who are big, huge experts on this, and they're all at a conference, and so we just don't want to talk about this. You know what? You know more than the reporter does, and you can be an effective carrier of science-based messaging without being the uber expert on this topic in the world. And this plays into all of our imposter syndrome and all of our anxieties about being called out on being wrong. But if you just keep it at a level where you're comfortable and it's simple, you can do fine. Okay, if you aren't the best source, build relationships, and you can do that by helping them find somebody else if you are not the right person. And your communications officers do that all the time. Don't bury the bottom line. Again, we're going to talk a little bit about the order in which you do your messaging, and be relaxed and friendly. You know, most of the time they're just trying to do a job. We're just trying to do a job. We just want to build relationships and be relaxed and friendly. There's no reason to get uptight. And you know what? You have the right to say, hey, I didn't say that right. Can I say it over? And most of the time you're not live, right? The vast majority of the time. So preparing for the interview. Now the stuff that's on the right-hand column here is the stuff on that research PR assessment tool. What is your key message? State your conclusion and back it up. This is not where we talk about our lit review and our methodology, okay, and then how we did the experimentation and what our sample size was. This is where we talk about what the bottom line is. Learn what other people are writing about the issue, especially if it's controversial. So folks who work in health disparities, that can get politicized. Folks who work in policy, that can get politicized. Just try to understand what is being said out there and have some facts and figures at hand from, an organization where people can check for third-party validation. So I used to use American Cancer Society stats a lot. I used to use American Heart Association stats a lot. I used to use Alzheimer's Association stats because there's a public website where people can go check it. If it's for a television or a portrait, what visuals do you have available? Some of us who are what I say keyboard biologists, it's awful. We don't have visuals. Nutritionists have life a little bit easier. What visuals can you think about that you might have available?
So a lot of journals and people are doing visual abstracts of their work. I've seen it in tweets and Facebook.
Yeah, so my answer to that is going to be it's highly dependent on how detailed your visual abstract is, okay? Because they're not going to probably focus on it for long periods of time on camera. And if it's so detailed that you can't get the gist of it in about 10 seconds, it's probably not appropriate, okay? And I'll give you an example that's completely not related to medicine. So Syracuse was just in the Camping World Bowl in Orlando, and we're doing a service project in Orlando with an organization that takes surplus furniture and other things and helps people who have been homeless get back on their feet with household goods and things. And the first t-shirt that was developed for this had about 47 things on it, and it was in 3 colors, and you couldn't really read it unless you got right in front of somebody and stared at it for a few seconds. And we were like, that's not going to work. So we had t-shirts made that had one message on them in white on orange shirts, and it was fine. But that's the scannability, right? It's why logos tend to be abstract. Too much detail and you lose them. Okay, so appearance and background. So the famous scientist whose children broke in while he was on a Skype interview is the best example ever for paying attention to your background. And I thought this was fun. You want to think about your posture, your attire. You know, a lot of times women, we wear jewelry that clicks against microphones and stuff, so we try to be careful about that. I learned that from Lisa Carey in Carolina. She was like, yeah, one time I went on stage at ASCO and I had this big chunky necklace in, and I kept trying to figure out what was clicking every time I moved, you know, because she had a lav mic on and it was clicking against her necklace. The attire guidelines we were talking about, in general, try to avoid stripes, checks, busy patterns. Colors are generally better than white. This guy did a great job for the most part in choosing his background. He has a lot of visual clutter here that he could have moved out of the way, but the books and the door and the map were all fine in the back of his chair until his children escaped. But anyway, if you are a fidgeter, try not to do interviews on camera where you're in a rolly chair, because you will unconsciously fidget and then you will be blurry. I used to have a boss who was a fidgeter, and he had a big desk with a big chair behind it and not a lot of room to roll things. So I always had to have somebody come and move his chair and put a static chair there when he was doing an interview, because I didn't want him to be doing like this. And he was kind of a hyperactive pediatrician and he just couldn't sit still. So we try to do that. And what's in the background? So I think that I took that out of here. Okay, so I did at one time have an actual list of things that I have removed from behind people on camera. They include a box of Fruit Loops, rats swim for Fruit Loops, and a stuffed mouse that looked really, really real, an inflatable palm tree, Christmas lights, a plaque that said 15 reasons why Duke sucks, which, you know, whether or not you agree with that, you probably don't want that in your background. A full-size stuffed eagle. You know, there's just been lots of random stuff that I've had to move. So, and one time I had to take an entire set of pictures of a president of a university over again, because nobody noticed that the bird artwork in his office had created an illusion that there were birds growing out of his head in every picture. So, you know, try to think about it, back up from it, take more than a second to look and see what your background looks like. But this guy is like the best example. And so I had to add him because everybody's seen it. So when you're doing the interview, yes, you can ask. If people ask to tape the interview, say yes, because they're going to get it right. And then if you are doing an interview and you say, hey, I misspoke, I would like to say that again in a different way, you have that on tape and there's a record of it. Don't relax too much. If you're too colorful, you will, like Fernando, be quoted in the paper and might miss an opportunity about the mice running around. Y'all, I went through 4 levels of approval to get that mouse picture approved. Eliminate distractions. Again, like on Skype, don't put yourself in the corner because you'll be distracted by your own image. You know, interviewing people in open spaces where people are walking around, their eyes will tend to follow them. Try not to do that. Repeat your main point. Don't say, well, don't up talk. Just if you need to take a moment to pause, to think about your answer, pause before you start to talk, because they're going to edit this anyway and you control that, right? So you can pause and say, you know, or even say, give me a minute to think about that, and then start with your thoughts gathered. Concise, and don't be defensive. I mean, you know, I've had very confrontational situations with reporters where I've said things like, you know, that particular question is just really far outside my expertise and I'm not comfortable answering it. I can try to find you an answer, but, you know, I just can't speak to that. And that's okay.
Ellen?
Yeah.
One question. In an interview, then you're just answering questions that people are asking. And so
yeah,
the audience is hearing both the question and the answer. But other times things get edited where they just want your answer. And we found with some people that it helps to, the question was, how long did it take you to study? If you say, oh, about 6 years, that's not usable. But if you say, completing this study took us 6 years, sort of.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. And also, you know, here at University of Alabama, Birmingham, we is a good way to start. You know, or our team at UAB has. Repeating the name of your institution, your PIOs will love you. And that's a really great point, is try, in some of the cases where you think that they're going to cut out the reporter and the reporter's not on camera, you should try to speak in complete sentences. And that's where having your messaging down first will help you, right? Because you can have complete sentences and you can say them. And if you keep them short, then you'll even remember what they are, I promise. Just keep it simple. Jargon. Don't say myocardial infarction when you can say heart attack. Don't say etiology when you can say cause. Okay. We have a lot of issues. We're really close to our particular fields, and we think everybody knows what we mean. So I had an interaction with a physician and a patient at UNC Chapel Hill one time, and then I had the opportunity to stay behind and talk with the patient a little bit, and that allowed me to go to the PI and say, I need you to understand that when you say a novel therapeutic, the patient hears like you're going to whack them with a Jane Austen book, right? They're not hearing what you're saying. They don't understand what that means. So you have to explain and define your terms. So I've got a couple of links here. University of Iowa has a great site for medical terms in lay language. A lot of CTSA schools do. I was just looking this up just to be curious, but in the recently, or the American Journal of Emergency Medicine, where they're, moving at a pretty quick clip, they did a study where people asked people what things meant, and they didn't know the difference between, they didn't know what hemorrhage meant. They didn't know what a fracture was. They didn't know heart attack versus myocardial infarction, stitches versus sutures. People just don't, they aren't as close to it as we are. We have to be clear, and it's really true for the media. And then there's statistics. Reporters are not numerate, and we all have cognitive biases when we interpret statistics, right? We have anchoring. Those of you who work in health behavior know about these things. People don't trust statistics because they don't understand what they mean. And they don't understand a sample versus a population and generalizable statistics. It really helps if you define the population under study. So don't say, we found that this drug helped these people with this diagnosis in 80% of the cases. Say, we found in a group of men between 55 and 72 that this, be that specific, because not being specific is how do you get to those headlines that give you a heart attack, right? So be specific. Don't assume that journalists understand tests of significance. Don't. There's a great book that's in my resource list that's called What is a P-Value Anyway, that can give you some ways to explain what your descriptive statistics and what your tests of significance mean to journalists in a way that's understandable. But try to say 2 out of 3 or 70%. But we know that even when we're talking about weather forecasts, people don't understand the percentages. So try to be very, very clear when you're using statistics. Like, it means a lot if you're up in front of a conference of your peers, what your sample size was, right? What significance tests you use for these particular situations, and what kind of power you had in your study. The general public and the media don't care, and they're not going to understand what it means. So you can say things like, well, this was a study that was really small, and so we don't know if we did this for the whole population, if this would be true, but we can say based on this little small study that this happened. Or one of the things that Framingham and some of the other big studies have done in the nurses study are, they're really well powered. And you can say in a large study, and people kind of understand that that's a little more certain, but they're just not going to understand test of significance. So this is my new cartoon about eye charts, which is kind of fun. reporter tricks and how to handle them. Has anybody ever had a negative interaction with a reporter? Okay, what happened? Tell me about it.
Well, I would say that one of the things I hate the most is if it's somebody that really has not done interviews very much before, and you feel like the questions are all over the place, and it takes a long time to kind of get your message across. I mean, part of that might be something happened in a while, but there's a big difference between someone in the New York Times interviewing you and somebody in the.
Absolutely. Now, who here has watched CNN or Fox News lately? Anybody? So why do we feel that we're under obligation to answer the question they asked, right? We don't necessarily have to be under the obligation to answer the exact question they asked. Nobody else does. And I'm going to talk to you in a minute about some bridging techniques, and you can have these slides, which Becky will have. And I have trained people with this deck, and I've had a couple of people take the actual slides on bridging statements and leave them in front of them when they're on the phone with somebody and use them, and they can be really helpful. Anybody else? Negative interaction with a reporter?
This one, I know it was my fault, but a reporter called me up and wanted to know about cancer clusters and a potential cancer cluster in Alabama. I was like, I don't even know. And so I told them I would get back to them with another thing, but then they were sort of asking me questions about like how you would go about it, and they quoted that.
Yeah, and that's where you say, this is really not my field, and I just don't have the expertise to speak to that. Just have your little script ready, and that'll help you, and then it'll pop into your brain when you're under stress. But yeah, cancer clusters are one of the things I really, really hate when reporters ask about them, because most of the time they're based completely on anecdata. One of my finest moments is I went to Dr. Earp, who is the once and future director of UNC Lineberger, and said, Shelley, I just want you to know, because we don't get credit for things that we make not happen, that I just made Nightline go away. Because they wanted to know about a potential cancer cluster at Camp Lejeune. There were some psychosocial issues that the physician was really uncomfortable with, having to do with the patient and the family's interaction, and he didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole, and they were really obnoxious. And so I made them go away. So really, that's where I say you have the freedom from talking to the media as a faculty member, right? The beauty of free speech is it works both ways. Okay, so don't answer hypothetical questions like, how would you go about this? Well, I've never done that kind of study, and it can be complex, and I just don't know the answer to that. Asking you to speculate on something you know little about, pushing you until you say no comment. Now, that's mostly for us administrators. We get all the tough questions, people like him. We're talking to the news when it's bad news, right? Don't let them trick you into speaking disparagingly of somebody else or assigning blame. When they put words in your mouth, like when they start a sentence with, so you're saying that, that's a red flag, right? And you should say, and you should be very clear. Actually, I didn't say that. What I said was, boom, your message. Just really, really clear. Because you don't want to let them put words in your mouth. The waiting tactic where they say, do you have anything else to add? If you don't have a canned message that you want to repeat, the answer is always no. No, I think that'll do it. And chatting after the interview is over about irrelevant things. So one of the things that I am infamous for is I fired a very prominent PR firm in Boston when I was SVP at Brandeis, because they went to an interview about executive compensation with our former president. And they allowed him to chit-chat with well, first off, they allowed him to take a very smug-looking photo sitting behind his desk, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed. And for somebody who's getting a $4.5 million golden parachute, it's just not a good look. But they were chit-chatting after the interview about his work on donkeys and literature, and guess what the headline ended up being? Oh, Brandeis is paying this man a very large amount of money to write a book on donkeys. Right? So these things happen when you chit-chat after the interview, and you shouldn't. When you're done, you're done. Just, you know, busy yourself with something else. It's all good. But then I fired the PR firm who we had sent in with him. And
Another issue to think about sometimes is live mic.
yeah, live mic issues are big.
When you have a satellite interview, we usually keep people out of the room until they're ready for the interview because
That can be true at panel discussions, at big meetings. For policy people at meetings, there can be live mic issues. You know, I'm always careful to instruct people when they get mic'd up about what the situation is going to be. And so just kind of assume that you have a live mic unless you don't.
We always tell our experts, you know, just assume the camera's on, even if they may say it's off, it may still be on. So.
Yeah, and you know, this is where I say don't try to be flip or funny because it backfires, and that's what gets picked up. And you know, the headline about donkeys, oh boy, that one was pretty. Anyway, so answering tough questions. Here's some examples that I made up just for you. What are the chances that we'll have a major Ebola outbreak in the US? Do you think that there are too many surgeries for prostate cancer? So you're saying that healthcare is too expensive and hospitals shouldn't invest in new technologies? Okay, here's your cheat sheet on how to make that do better and get your message across. Bridging or touch and go. So this is a cornucopia of statements that you may use to get your reporter back to the point. If they're asking you a question that you are like, when did you stop beating your wife question, or when did you stop kicking your dog question, you want to use a bridging statement. So you can say, well, that's an interesting question, but you know, what's really important to remember here is, if we look at the big picture, the larger issue is, let me put this all in perspective by saying, and bridge back to your point, these are things that are completely legit ways to get out of it. Like I said, just because they ask you a question doesn't mean that you literally have to answer all parts of the question. You can answer part of it or none of it and bridge back to your main point. Okay? That's the other thing is, one of my favorite ones, which is really, really common, is before we continue, let me emphasize that, right? Because that's when they're trying to get you off on a tangent. That's one that's really good that I use all the time. So the heart of the matter is, well, that could be a factor, but what matters most in this situation is, you know, if they're trying to get you off on a cancer cluster is a great way to do that. You know, what matters most in this situation is that we diagnose a cancer cluster based on the actual data that we find in the cancer registry. While people may perceive that something is going on in this area, that's not based on the actual data, right? Those kind of things. Those are great. If they try to put words in your mouth and say, well, so you're saying blah, blah, blah. Well, you know, it would actually be more correct to say, let me point out again. If they're trying to skip over your point, you know, before we leave that subject, let me just say that these things, you can keep it in front of you and use them. And they are absolutely great ways to get back to your topic. And this is like, I've compiled these over 20 years and I add to them and subtract from them all the time, but people have told me that they're useful, so I like to include them. So, beware of loaded questions. This is where so you have a dog, right? Yes. Okay, and so sometimes your dog bites people. Well, he only did that one time. So have you stopped kicking your dog? That's where they build up to the loaded question, right? Unacceptable alternatives. Would you rather that we live in a police state, or would you rather that we had 100% vaccination rate in children, right? Okay, those are unacceptable alternatives. Hypothetical situations. Well, okay, well, what would you do if you had a patient who had this bizarre symptom and this happened and that happened? That happens a lot when people are alleging medical malpractice and that kind of thing. So just don't do that. Don't speak for other people. You speak for yourself. Speak for yourself. I mean, I've had situations where I had my last job, we had a lot of FDA contracts, and they were like, well, would you say that the FDA is? And I'm like, no, can't speak for the FDA, sorry. You know, don't speak for other people. Divide and conquer. So especially in issues if there's been a high profile, like I dealt with this a lot when Anil Patti at Duke was found to have falsified a bunch of data. And a lot of my PIs had issued joint papers with him based on falsified data, which was literally actually falsified. Like they looked at the data, they had seen the data, and it was falsified. And so they will ask you, how would you handle this? Or why did you do this? And, you know, we had a very tight script, which was when we found out that the data had been falsified, we retracted the paper. That's all they had to say. Well, what would you have done if somebody asked you to make clinical recommendations based on this data? Well, you know, that's all Monday morning quarterbacking, and you don't want to go there. False premises and conclusions. I mean, here's a great example. An example I made up for you all is, you know, are you saying that medical care in the U.S. is expensive because we use too much technology? No, do your bridge. Let me be clear. Many medical technologies are life-saving, and it's impossible to put a monetary value on that. But, you know, if I'm an outcomes researcher and we find that this isn't effective for 100% of people, that's where you bridge to your message, right? Okay. So this is my president, former president at Brandeis, where I fired the PR firm, who got to talk about donkeys. And, you know, he didn't pose for the department photo, but he posed for that one. And the chair for Near Eastern and Judaic Studies said she didn't even know whether he was officially a member of the department. So this is what happens when you get too comfortable. You don't chit-chat about, or you chit-chat about unrelated things. Here's the other thing. The media has an ethics code just like everybody else. Now, some of them are more ethical than others, but most of the time that says that they are not going to allow you to review the article. Okay? What you can offer, and I did this for years, and it would always hit during my commute home from downtown Louisville. The Courier Journal would call me, and they'd be trying to interpret something one of my scientists say, and they'd be reading me stuff. And I'd say, no, you need to change this word to that, or change this word to the other thing, or let me call and ask them that, and I'll get back to you. So if you make yourself available when they're between the time that they interview you and the time that you're actually writing it up, or have your PIO make you available or transmit the questions to you, that's going to go a long way toward accuracy. Okay, but they hate it when you ask to see the story.
So is that different than press releases? Because a lot of times press releases, and again, maybe it's, you know, from like a medical society or
Yeah.
an institution, they will send you something to look through.
Yeah, and that's common practice. And I mean, I think you can say that the cardinal sin in our jobs is if we do a news release, a press release, or a web story that doesn't have sign off by the faculty members involved in the research. Like that in my, I have done formal written reprimands for people for not doing that. Okay, or for changing headlines without faculty buy-off. So if you're working with a partner, that is absolutely legit. If you're working with a reporter from your local NBC affiliate, they're not going to let you review it.
Yeah, we're always going to, when public relations specialists, we're always going to submit our press releases for source approval. So
yeah, I saw his face because that's like, you know, and I've had somebody say, oh, it doesn't really make any difference if I change this headline, or, you know, one time I have a great friend who used to be an AP reporter who worked on the main campus of the University of Louisville, and she taught me a ton about media relations, but she and I seriously were in a yelling match one time because she went through a release that I had drafted, and in the interest of changing like word variants, she had called a vaccine a drug, and I was like, you are going to get me fired. Stop it. It is not a synonym. You cannot do that, because, you know, that is just fundamental, right? They're definitions and they matter. So yeah, exactly. And I was like, no, I'm not showing that to a faculty with the word drug when you mean vaccine. Stop it. That was actually about Gardasil. Anyway, so any questions you have, any discussion that you would like to have, I am open, but I think I hit us right on the hour mark, and that was a complete accident, but You all have been a great attentive audience, and I always get nervous when my fellow PIOs are in the room, but hey, this is, you know, there's a lot of material here. I went over it quickly, but feel free to get the slides. And if you want to walk around with those bridging statements in front of you, I've had people come up to me like 6 months later and be like, that was the best.
My question is, I think your presentation gave us a lot of information about how to be responsive when media reaches out to us. I was just wondering if you have any advice about being like flipping that, like when we want to reach out to the media, are there certain components of kind of that initial outreach that we need to include? Yeah, so when you are going to call Todd, or you're going to call somebody on who's your public information staff, or you are the person reaching out in your case, the things that they're going to do for you or that you want to do are look at who's writing in the media about this topic and who you think might do a good job covering your topic. You want to know what your key messages are and what you want them to take away. So like, what is the message I'm trying to convey about this topic to the public? And when your PIOs, people can help you write what we call a pitch note. I mean, frankly, a lot of times we just don't do news releases anymore because the nature of media relations has changed so much. We'll do a web story, but then we'll write what's called a pitch note to get the attention of reporters who write on this topic who might be interested in it. You know, it depends on the market that you're in, but like I was working most recently in the Washington, D.C. market, and they are so inundated that a news release gets you nothing. Right? I would send a media advisory that we're having this event and we're going to web stream it and you can go here and watch, because that's how I would get them to write about it. But, you know, there are a lot of different things that you can do, but the most important thing is be clear about what you want out of the interaction, and be clear that you have a timely hook or something that's following the news. Right? So a timely hook is, don't tell me about the paper that you had in JAMA 2 months ago, because nobody cares now. Tell me about the paper that's coming out and that you have the galleys for that I might be able to look at. That's the thing that makes your PIOs cry, and we don't want to make grown men cry here. So don't, you know, when you forget about a paper coming out and it comes out and they see like the other institution involved in the paper has done a great news release on it and we totally missed the opportunity, that makes us cry. So we hate that. It just makes us, it's horrible. And, you know, we kind of get our jollies out of making you look good and getting the good news hits, and don't do that. Put it on your calendar if you have to. Write the email ahead of time and schedule it to send later, but don't make your PIOs cry by not, your public information officers cry by not telling us when you have big papers, right? A lot of times we'll reach out to you. Some of them have good systems like JAMA, and others have good systems where they'll reach out to us. But, you know, there are major journals that are in subspecialties that don't do that. And so if you've got something important, say, tell us.
And I'll say, you know, if you can give us as much lead time as possible, that's great. But we also understand that the deadlines change and we have to be flexible as well. But our team is, you know, when it comes to pitching media or getting you media ready, we have tons of resources available. We offer media trainings. We can video you and critique you as we're going along.
That's really worthwhile. It really hurts, but it's really worthwhile. And it is. And, you know, I've done that with folks who had controversial findings or things that might be questioned, and helped them a lot. And I think they perform much better than they would have. And it's a great service to take advantage of. Also, if you're fortunate enough to get a paper in Nature, their embargoes lift on Sundays at 1 p.m. Eastern, and we hate them. Yes, we do. So give your PIO plenty of notice. If it's Tuesday, it must be JAMA, but Nature on Sunday, we just don't like them.
This is probably a very naive question, but if you ask, I'd like to restart, I don't feel like I said that very well. Can I restate my answer? What's their obligation to taking the second, third, or the next answer?
Generally, a good reporter will try to follow you and do that and say, oh, okay, wait a minute, I misspoke. That's not accurate. Let me, you know, restate that. Good reporters will do that. The times when you're going to have more of a problem is if you're in a controversial or adversarial situation, which most faculty are not. The times I've been in those situations are things like when we fired the former Lieutenant Governor of Kentucky from the Department of Orthopedics for not showing up when he was on call. Those are the kind of things that you are gonna mainly, that's why we exist. We're here as your shield against that kind of thing. So pass that along. The last thing we want to hear is that you made an answer that you wasn't fully informed or didn't understand institutional policy that we have to go mop up. Although, job security it gives us job security, but it's not our favorite activity. Like when I was at University of Missouri and somebody gave a burn permit for a student group to burn the Al-Qaeda flag on the quad. And I was like, what? How did that happen?
In addition to what Adam said, we developed panels of experts. And those are people who were chosen for their expertise, their ability to speak, presented. They're all given training. And a lot of those are trending topics because when something is developing, like Ebola, they want to know who that is.
Yeah, Ebola, a lot of the health policy issues, anything that I would call a slow-moving crisis. Faith was telling me about her class doing some work on relationship violence, and of course there's been a lot about certain celebrities in the media. That kind of thing is really great. And if you can be trained and you get to know your friends and your PR department, they're going to be really helpful to you.
And then I'm sure you have software like we do, like Meltwater,
Yeah.
where we can look up a term or a certain topic and find everybody who's written about that within a certain amount of time. We can restrict that to top level journals. We can have it in local media.
Yeah, they have tools. They can slice and dice for you. They can find out, who you want to talk to. And the beauty of things is it used to be those of us who were in smaller media markets really, 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 really had to hustle to get into the big papers. But now with Skype and the technology, it's so much easier to do. So, yeah.
So would you comment on some of the predatory PR?
Oh, that's a great example. So there are companies out there who will call up and say, I'm from PBS and we're doing a documentary on X and your department can be featured in it. And we want to talk to this expert and this expert and this expert about that. And then once you get down, and they will target the faculty. They will avoid talking to the professional communicators because we know who they are. And you'll get your chair, your dean, or somebody all excited about it. And then they sort of think, oh, that'll be $50,000. And it is, there's also companies out there who do it so we can feature you at such and such a meeting. And generally speaking, I think that our academic audiences are cynical about what is PR and marketing and what is actual news, and that technique can backfire on you. The ones that are saying, we're from PBS, Johns Hopkins has a really good FAQ on their Johns Hopkins medical site about this stuff, and they have a great myth versus fact thing too, which is fabulous. But they probably don't actually have a contract. They're making it on spec. And so one time, do you all remember the story? I think it was or the show on TLC. It was called Future Weapons, I think. And it had this like big burly military guy, and they would like shoot enormous guns and stuff like that. Well, they came to us at University of Louisville and wanted to bring in Ken Alibek, who's a controversial person who was in the Russian intelligence and weaponized smallpox, and have him talk about smallpox and bioweapons in our facility. And I was like, no, we're not doing that. And they came back to us and actually deep sixed Alibek and used our faculty in infectious diseases and simulation. And that was a win-win. And by being tough and ethical about it, we were able to get the segment on the show, but in a way that wasn't exploitative of our resources for somebody else's gain. And I worked with Ron Atlas at the time, who's a prominent, deterrence of bioweapons and biowarfare, and he was like spitting mad about that at Ken Albeck. They were like, he is not setting foot on campus. I'm like, well, technically it's public, but no, we're not going to do that in our facility. So,
Any other questions?
thanks all.
All right, thank you.